So Nancy, you wanted to start, no?
Yeah, I will start, right?
Yes, please.
Yeah, but there's people are joining. Still people are joining now. Can we wait just a minute because the number is raising?
Yeah, perhaps we should just give a sign that we are about to start.
اوكي. مرحبا، كيف حالكم؟ مشان تسمعوا باللغة العربية، في عنا شكل كرة أرضية اللي بفاتح من اللابتوب. نكبس عليها ونضغط على فرنش. فرنش هي باللغة العربية عشان تقدروا تسمعوا السيشن باللغة العربية. أي حدا فاتح من الموبايل بيروح على الثلاث نقاط اللي موجودة على اليمين تحت، وبفتح على برضه interpretation. لما نفتح عليها نكبس على الفرنش، وهيك بتقدروا تسمعوا السيشن باللغة العربية. شكرا لكم. You can start, Marcus.
Okay, thank you very much for this information. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome from my side. I hope that you're all doing well and got easily connected to this online panel discussion, which is co-organized by Friedrich Ebert Foundation and the German Development Institute, Deutsches Institut für Entwicklungspolitik in Bonn. My name is Markus Löwe. I'm head of the Middle East and North Africa research team at the German Development Institute. And I have the honor to moderate today's discussion with my dear colleague, Henrik Meyer, who is country representative of Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Tunis. Today, we want to talk on economic reforms as an opportunity, a post-COVID social contract for the MENA region. We are all aware of the fact that economic development has been disappointing in all MENA countries, even before COVID-19 spread all over the world. Growth in the MENA region has not generated enough employment for the growing populations. It has not been pro-poor, but rather intensified inequalities in the region. And it has not even been really sustainable because it was based on quick wins from speculative investments in extractive industries, in real estate and other, rather than on investment in manufacturing or agriculture. Research that we and others have conducted over the last 10, 20 years has shown that this weakness of growth is due to the lack of rule of law in many MENA countries and the lack of dearly needed reforms in regulation, education, health, finance, infrastructure, and many other areas. And COVID-19 has aggravated the economic and social problems of the MENA region, but also made entirely obvious their structural causes. Research that we have started to conduct recently shows already that the trust of citizens in their governments has suffered substantially because citizens see these structural problems much more clearly now during the COVID crisis. And therefore, we ask if COVID-19 might also be a chance that policymakers finally embark on the dearly needed economic and political reforms. That's the question of today's discussion. There will be increased expectations on the side of foreign donors who will have to provide substantial loans to MENA countries in order to save them from bankruptcy. But citizens will also increase their claims for a new social contract. At DIE in Bonn, we have conducted research on the concept of the social contract and on social contracts in the MENA region. And to just give a suggestion for how we could define social contracts, we define them as the entirety of agreements between all relevant societal groups and the governments of a country, defining the rights and obligations of all parties towards each other. I will highlight this definition in a minute in the chat function. In the past, the social contracts of MENA countries were more or less all based on the selective provision of social services and business opportunities to societal groups that were loyal to the government. This restrained growth and exacerbated inequality. So the uprisings in 2011 have already been a strong protest against the old social contracts. But people might return to the streets now if governments do not reform the social contracts and make them more inclusive and more sustainable. On our website, we have created an overview on conceptual and empirical publications on the social contract by us and others. And in a minute, I will also copy a link to it into the comments function of this video conference. However, I would like now to hand over to Hendrik Meyer, who will co-moderate this session from Friedrich Ebert Foundation and who will also explain some issues on this event. Please, Hendrik.
Thank you very much, Marcos, and good afternoon from Tunisia, or good morning to our panelists in the US. My name is Hendrik Meyer. I am the director of the Tunisia office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and I am greeting you from La Marsa in Tunisia. At the beginning, just one reminder, you have heard it at the beginning, we have English and Arabic translation, so please, you can select this on the bottom right of the Zoom window. Just a few words, I don't want to speak long, about the idea of this event. The Friedrich Ebert Foundation, which I represent, is Germany's oldest political foundation. We have 95 years of history and 100 offices all over the world. And we have teamed up for this event with the German Development Institute, as Marcos has already mentioned. I believe both institutions share a common goal, that is to understand what is necessary to make international cooperation fruitful and mutually beneficial, particularly in times of crisis. And I believe we all agree that we are in the midst of a deep crisis. We all understand that the current corona pandemic has shown us the weaknesses and the weak links in international cooperation, as it was breathtakingly quick to throw ideas of solidarity overboard. And we all understand that the crisis will make it even harder to achieve better social justice. Today we will discuss the idea of a post-COVID social contract as one important scenario for the future. And today's debate is actually part of a series of 4 events under the title Until Death Tear Us Apart. We have started last Tuesday with a very interesting discussion on the role of international financial institutions in the crisis and after the crisis. And we will have 2 more events next Tuesday and the Tuesday after that. Same time, which would be 2 p.m. in Tunis, or it's a slightly different time wherever you are. But you will, of course, receive the invitations. So please check your inboxes, check our websites and our Facebook pages. We will be happy to see you for our next events as well. Concerning today's meeting, just very few technical remarks before I hand over the floor to our panelists, who will then give short inputs to start the debate. We will then, after the inputs, have maybe a few questions from us moderators to the panelists, but simultaneously, you are also invited to ask questions. The floor is open to questions from the audience immediately, also during the panelists give their inputs. If you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function of Zoom. The Q&A function is more or less in the center bottom of the Zoom window. It's a Q&A with 2 bubbles. If you click on that, you can then ask questions, and then I or Marcus, we will give you the floor to ask this question by voice. Please do not use the chat for asking questions, because there's so much happening in the chat. It's very difficult. It will be difficult to see the questions there. You can use the chat to discuss between you and the audience, and you can also use it if you have technical issues, for example. We will try to answer to those things, but if you have questions to the panelists, please use the Q&A function for that. It is made for that. Yes, and if you ask a question, very important, please always let us know whom the question is directed to, so we can ask the respective panelists to answer. We have, for this entire debate, 90 minutes, so now we have 80 minutes left, and I think that will be enough time for a very good and interesting debate. And Marcus, I give the floor back to you, so you can introduce our distinguished panelists.
Thank you very much for this, Henrik. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you our 3 most honorable speakers today. We have with us Ayat Suleiman, Regional Director for Sustainable Development in the MENA region at the World Bank, Professor Dr. Mustafa Kamel Nabli, former Minister and Governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia, and Hans Frühauf, Regional Director for the MENA region at GIZ, the German Agency for Technical Cooperation. Professor Navli will make the start. He was professor of economics in 5 countries, regional chief economist at the World Bank, Minister of Economic Development, Minister of Planning and Regional Development, Governor of the Central Bank in Tunisia, and advisor to many international organizations. And he published innumerable articles and books. The last book from 2019, if I'm up to date, with a quite programmatic title, J'y crois toujours, au-delà de la débâcle, une Tunisie démocratique et prospère. I still believe in it, beyond the disaster, a democratic and prosperous Tunisia. I find this title very challenging, and Professor, we hope to benefit from your insights. The floor is yours. You have to unmute.
Get my, okay. Thanks, Marcus, and thanks to the IW and the foundation for this invitation and for this opportunity. The title that you just mentioned about the book, that was 1.5 years ago. That's a long time ago. I will not tell you whether I have changed my mind on this one or not, but you'll get a sense. So you have asked us to reflect on the issue of whether the COVID-19 crisis, health crisis, and the ensuing economic and financial crisis would be easing the way for achieving a new social contract in MENA countries, and with some special thoughts on Tunisia. I would like to try to answer this question by making 3 observations. My first observation is a broad one on the issue of the COVID-19 and the implications of this. I have been very struck by something, which is that anyone who wishes to achieve something, tries to project it on COVID-19, post-COVID-19, and try to say that post-COVID-19 is going to be responding to his or her wishes. And everybody has their own wish. So some people see the collapse of the capitalist strong player. Some people see an environmental agenda which is predominant, so climate change and others. Some people see more equity, more redistribution. Some people see a new digital world. So everybody, they kind of, choose whatever their main concern and try to project it on COVID-19. And the COVID-19, post-COVID-19 will help achieve their wish, if you like, or their what they aspire to. And I'm afraid that we are falling into this trap by asking the question whether post-COVID-19 will be helping us get a new social contract in MENA. It seems to me that we are projecting our wish that we want to see a new social contract, and we are using COVID-19 crisis and try to see whether this will help achieve that social contract. And why I say that, because I see very little analytical or empirical evidence for a movement towards that. And actually, I see the opposite happening, probably. So I'm a little bit contrarian view here. So let's see why. And this leads to my second observation. What are the prospects in the MENA region in post-COVID-19? What's new? What did COVID-19 bring? I think the reality is that the post-COVID-19 world in MENA would have very, very constraining new features. Higher debt levels by governments and business. Government and business are coming out of this crisis, heavily indebted, much more heavily indebted than they used to be. Huge losses in welfare are taking place. Increases in poverty, probably. Losses in many social gains, whether it's in education, health, or obviously health and life expectancy and what have you. We are going to have a legacy of nationalism and egoism at the global level, but a legacy of conflicts in the region, which is going to be there with us for a long, long time. And we are going to have to face very few and limited sources of growth. In the oil exporting countries, the prospects for the oil rents and oil revenue don't look good. For the non-major oil exporters, the prospects for global trade growth and so on don't look good. So the scope for the world, which is easier to play and grow in, is going to be much constrained. So these conditions are not good for a new social contract because they put more constraints, not more possibilities. And they're much more conducive to conflict and to tensions rather than to contract and to compromise. So we have to keep that in mind, which leaves me to my third observation, which is the conclusion from that. So if you strip out the wishes and hopes that we have, or that some will have, such as the IFIs, and Ayat might want to comment on that, it is difficult for me to see the outline of any possible new social contract post-COVID as of now. The reasons are the frictions and tensions and conflicts, as I said before, the limited ability and readiness to compromise and in the countries of the region, within each countries. There is the lack of resources to facilitate any compromise for such contracts. There are no resources, no free resources, everything is constrained. And that's why we are seeing more and more conflicts, more and more tensions. You have seen how Lebanon has exploded. You have seen how Iraq is doing. You have seen how Libya is doing. So everywhere you look, you don't see a movement towards compromise. You don't see movement towards contracts on agreeing on something common. You just see tensions and conflicts. And I see this is happening everywhere. So let me illustrate this tendency, this movement with the case of Tunisia. What we see since the last 10 years, since the revolution, if you like, we have seen the process of reforms grind to halt, essentially. No more reforms, real reforms. The prospects for reform don't look any good as we look forward in the coming period. We see strong demand for distribution, not to finding common solutions. We see at the same time very strong resistance to redistribution, so there is no agreement. The newly introduced open democratic system governance, which is the big gain since the revolution happened in Tunisia, has been unable and does not seem in the near future able to achieve consensus and compromise on the economic and social front. We see more tensions and conflict on the social front, and we are seeing even on the political front. So the political debate, broadly speaking, is directionless. It is not at all clear to me what a new social contract or a new bargain would entail and mean now in Tunisia as we speak. There is, of course, the social contract that the IFIs may want, or the IW may want, as Marcus was trying to tell us. But I'm not seeing demand for it. I'm not seeing the movements toward that. Every group and subgroup in the country has their own views of what they want and what they're trying to achieve. Some want more government and less markets. Some want more markets and less government. Some want more governments and less private sector. Some see private sector as the solution and the lighter hand of the state. Some demand support and strengthening of public enterprises and they are heavier and they have a burden on the budget. Others require privatization and rationalization. Some see more inward orientation and some see more integration with global markets. Some see more distribution and so on. And I can go on any issues about reforms and about the issue that. So overall, from my perspective as I speak today and given what I'm seeing and I'm feeling, overall, I have a hard time identifying and defining what a new social contract would look like in a country like Tunisia today. There is no consensus on any kind of social contract and how it would look like. I have been trying personally to help, bring people together to agree on something. And I have to tell you, it has not been successful. There has been very little acceptance of the issue of getting together and agreeing on something with different stakeholders. There is a need for a political process which can help design and arrive at such a social contract. But no one is ready. The political process is not able to do that. Even a democratic country like Tunisia today, its democratic process has been, the big failure has been its inability to be effective in reaching such an objective. And therefore, I can tell to you today that from the perspective of what I see today, I don't see any post-COVID-19 situation where there is a movement towards a new social contract. Maybe it will happen, maybe it will come, and let's wish for a miracle to happen, but it's not happening today. And I'm not sure I'm seeing it happening anywhere else actually in the MENA region. So my answer to your question, Marcus and Hans and everybody, is that I'm not looking forward to see that happen. Actually, we're going to see more tensions, more problem in post-COVID-19. We are going to deal with more difficult issues and more tensions as we go forward. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mustafa. Although, of course, we would all be happy if you had come to a more optimistic scenario, but I think this has given a quite interesting view into especially your, of course, your experience in Tunisia, but also the other MENA countries. And we are grateful, very grateful for this very interesting statement. We now turn to our second speaker, Ayat Suleiman. Ayat is Regional Director for the World Bank Sustainable Development Department for the MENA region, which is a quite large one with more than 100 people, as I've read. Before, Ayat has been working for 25 years already on sustainable development questions in the bank, in the UN, and in the private sector. She has a BA in HR management from Cornell and a Master of Science from AUC. And as you may know, the World Bank was among the first donors using the term social contract in its analytical concepts. And only recently, the World Bank has published the report, Building for Peace, with inputs from our colleague, Professor Bernhard Trautner from DIE, which also builds on the social contract concept. So I think, Ayat, we are very much looking forward to hearing what you think about the question, the chance that MENA countries reform their social contracts more quickly. Please, Ayat.
Thank you very much, Marcus, Henrik, and it's an honor to come after Dr. Mustafa, and I will try my best to give a slightly more optimistic view, even though I do share his views that it is a very difficult time. So let me start by just giving a little bit of an indication of how COVID has hit the region. 25 million jobs have been lost only in the first half of 2020. Dr. Mustafa talked about the impacts on Tunisia, and it is seen and felt across the region. The GDP growth stands at minus 5.7%, and it goes across from GCC countries to middle income and of course low income countries in the MENA region. So really this is unprecedented, and as Dr. Mustafa said, it will wipe out many of the gains, and it is wiping as we speak many of the gains that the countries have been trying to put in place, including through reforms that have been difficult, have been challenging and contested in the public space, whether it is around fuel subsidies or structural reforms, etc. We are seeing a problem of ability to retain imports, especially on food imports, which is critical. FDI flows have essentially come to a halt. Public capital investment capacity has also come down very much. And as Dr. Mustafa mentioned, debt levels are rising and of course are going to be a challenge in the medium to long term for a capacity of the countries to do adequate response programs. At the same time, MENA was already in a very difficult bind before COVID, and many of these challenges relate to the conflict. Youth unemployment, for example, stands at 26%. Unemployment ratio in general is among the highest in the world at 43%. Female labor force participation stands at 22%, and informal employment in the informal sector ranges, depending on the countries, between 50 and 75%. But that's not the full story. The story also goes to say, and this is where actually the sectors that I work on become critical. We can't forget about climate change. Climate change is already hitting the region very hard, in a water scarce region, in a region where, you know, the vulnerability of people to extreme weather events is extremely high, and it hits highest on the poor. So for example, just to give an example, 0.5 meter sea level rise in Tunisia, for the coast of Tunisia, and we are seeing as we speak the coastal erosion impacting Tunisia, with, you know, meters of erosion showing up in the satellite images. Only 0.5 meter sea level rise will impact $2.6 billion or 10% of GDP loss. So, and if you look at that across the region, if you look at what it means for, of course, we have the refugee crisis, which much of it is conflict, but not all of it. We understand that many of the Syrian refugees also fled water scarcity and inability to manage degraded lands. The issue of inclusion, youth inclusion, women inclusion, and girls was critical before. And now, of course, with COVID, we are very worried about, you know, for example, gender-based violence against women really impacting further and further their ability to retain their participation in society and their productive employment. So for all of these reasons, even though it is a very difficult path, and I agree with Dr. Mustafa that these pressures are going to be putting on the governments less and less capacity to respond, the path forward has to, and that's where I'd like to draw from the World Bank Group approach paper that came out in June on the response to COVID. It has to be green, it has to be inclusive, and it has to be resilient. And that's where it comes into a strong link to the social contract, because the MENA strategy for the World Bank, even before COVID, looked at really a rebuilding of the social contract as essential for MENA countries to build, to go towards peace and stability in the region. Now, what does it mean to look at a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery? And is there space to do that? It's not all as easy as, let's say, for governments that can put up green stimulus packages in the billions, which is what the EU has done, Asian countries are doing, and many other countries are doing. But I think that it does provide a space for reforms. So public capital investments are going to be scarce. So any reforms that increase efficiency of public spending alongside sectors that we have been calling for a long time, including in agriculture, including in water reuse efficiency, improving the targeting of subsidies, etc., and retooling public expenditures in these sectors, those are critical. They are going to benefit the government in its ability to free up dearly needed fiscal space and allow them to enhance these sector sustainabilities, which are really, really on the line. Then, as far as also green investments are concerned and green employment opportunities, these are again critical. MENA countries cannot go away from really needing to close the gap with other markets. If an unsustainable growth path is going to be chosen by countries, whether it is on high carbon intensive technologies or polluting technologies or investments that don't take into account the sustainability of the resource base, that is only going to grow the gap between them and other markets in terms of competitiveness in a global economy. At the same time, we have seen programs and we have engaged in programs with countries where these kinds of green investments, whether it is on landscape management, and particularly when it comes to vulnerable groups, and I'll come to that on the inclusion angle, which is critical for the social contract, we've seen that these investments, landscape restoration, digital and climate smart agriculture, and Morocco is a very good example with their new green generation strategy. These can really hit the triple wins: employment, sustainability, and resilience to future shocks. That's what these governments need. Now, let me talk about the inclusion agenda, which is extremely important in our work in sustainable development, and which goes to talking about some of the challenges that Dr. Mustafa put up on the table, but with a hope and a view towards what can we put in terms of mechanisms for dialogue, for making people understand what are the options, because I do agree that there is no consensus among stakeholders in countries that make reform paths in this current environment extremely difficult. At the same time, and that's what also our chief economist in the past few months has been working extensively on, is we need contestability, we need open data platforms, we need to share information and to create the space for dialogue. We also need to understand how the pandemic has hit different population groups differently. The vulnerable groups, the poor, have been hardest hit, and a new group of poor people has emerged. So really making sure that any reform, any investments, any recovery mechanisms is inclusive of these groups is going to be essential, regardless of whether it is going to rebound at the level that is expected. But even if you rebound at a slightly lower level, but you include these people, you will reduce the risk of further going into conflict and violence, which is what we've seen in the past. So it's really an imperative. It's critical that we understand very well and keep monitoring these impacts and understand the impacts on different groups. It's critical to create spaces for voice, contestability, feedback mechanisms. We talk a lot about citizen engagement in our programs, but that is important to be included also at the level of government systems. So let me stop with that, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, but really to emphasize that the green, the inclusive, and the resilient path to recovery has dividends, has short-term versus as well as medium-term wins, and is frankly an imperative that is, it's not a choice, it's an imperative for the MENA countries at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayat, for this extremely helpful information. And I'm also very grateful that you put so much emphasis on the need to make development more green, more sustainable, especially in this region where political and economic issues have always been so dominant that very little of the discussion has looked at these issues. Last not least, we have now with us Hans Frühauf, who is currently director of the Near and Middle East division at GIZ. Before, he had been serving GIZ on various other positions since 2007, and among others, he was head of GIZ's governance program in Ramallah between 2015 and 2019. So I think he also knows what it means to talk on social contracts in very difficult, in particularly difficult situation. Hans has a BA from Tübingen University and an MPA from York. And for quite a while, Hans headed a team at GIZ that has been working on the social contract concept. So I think he really is the person to answer our question. Please, Hans, we are listening to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you very much, Henrik, for the invitation. First of all, hello to Professor Nabil and Ayat. Great seeing you. And also great listening to you in such difficult times. And I agree to what you have outlined here. Your rather less optimistic view on the possibilities of negotiating a new social contract, but also on, I'd also agree with Ayat's points that we have to remain optimistic and we also have to look at the possibilities these times give us and offer us. I was introduced by Marcus as someone who worked on social contracts in the MENA region, and it's true that GIZ with the DIE, the German Development Institute, we are closely coordinating also with the German government on finding ways to support new social contracts in the MENA region and to also facilitate this through our day-to-day work. And I still have doubts, or I nevertheless have doubts, whether I'm the one who can answer your question, whether COVID-19 really offers a chance for a new social contract, whether I'm really the right person, because my humble, very, very humble answer would be yes and no. And I think also drawing and building on what Professor Nabil has said and Ayat has said, I think a lot of the answer will depend on whether we believe that COVID-19 makes states and societies in MENA more or less open for reforms. And I think we see here a paradox. If we look at the immediate responses to the COVID pandemic, I think we have seen a lot of solidarity within MENA societies. We have seen how communities act together to fight this pandemic and to keep everyone safe and healthy. And I think we have seen a lot of tremendous efforts which of community engagement also in the MENA region that were triggered by the pandemic. But we also see, obviously, a new level of state effectiveness in terms of really fighting this pandemic. We have seen that states with an often very, very top-down approach introduced new rules. They introduced a tight state overview, often even linked to close monitoring of citizens and surveillance, rather harsh measures, and often even the limitation of citizen rights. Inshallah, hopefully only on a temporary basis, but we have also seen this. And I think the question is now how these two trends, so the certain level of solidarity within the societies and also the ability to act in such a pandemic, but on the other hand, also those harsh state measures, which could be assigned for state effectiveness, how this will last in a post and how this will survive in a post COVID-19 environment. And I think the figures are very clear. Ayat presented them, Professor Nabil presented them. And I think we all agree that the need for reforms is tremendous, and that the pressure in a situation where we have a crisis on top of a crisis in an already fragile region is enormous. But I think the crucial question regarding a new social contract is whether it will be possible for the societies and for the states in the MENA region to recover from the pandemic without touching the fundamentals of the existing social contracts. And I think only if this will not be possible, and if public demand to reform increases after the pandemic, or if governments are pressured by balance sheets, by decreased revenues and so on, I think only then we will be able to answer the question whether the pandemic is really the right background and whether this really offers a new chance for a new social contract. I also believe that the other global crisis, so the crisis in the economy, the crisis around climate issues, will force governments to act. They cannot neglect and they cannot ignore the need to reform. And I think the debate and also the research that you did on the new social contract shows that we will only see positive and sustainable policy impacts of these reforms if these reforms are inclusive and if they focus on diversifying economies and making those economies more resilient to shocks. And I think in order to do this, governments are well advised to listen to the society and also to at least be open to discuss aspects of a new social contract. I don't believe in the emergence of a new social contract through revolution in these times. I don't believe in the emergence of a social contract by a huge public hearing where all stakeholders sit together and then out of the crisis and out of all the old conflicts, a new social contract peacefully negotiated emerges. I think we have to be aware that elements of social contracts are always results also of the power struggle. But I believe that the international community, the international financial institutions, the international donors, and the international community can play a very, very crucial role and can play an important role in facilitating or at least opening up the possibilities that new elements of social contracts, be it in the government sphere, be it in the economic sphere, be it in the social sphere, can be provided so that also the international support can pave a way. How can that be done? I think primarily, we have to be very, very humble, because the social contract, from my point of view, emerges from as a result of a debate within the societies in our partner countries and in the regions. So I anyway believe that the influence of external partners can only be limited in negotiating or enabling such negotiations on new social contracts. But what I believe is that the international community, with all their support they are also currently providing to the governments and the societies in the regions, that they can draw on a lot of lessons that we have learned. And I think this is, first of all, enabling debate and focusing not only now on a very, very short-term recovery, which is necessary to stabilize, obviously, economies in the current situation, and to also stabilize health systems and so on, but also enabling debate, creating spaces for these debates. I think we can also continue working on strengthening those participating in the debate, so to empower those groups that are currently not heard, those groups most vulnerable, and those groups most hit by the current crisis. And last but not least, also to support state actors in engaging in this dialogue and also offering alternatives to the current policies. I think this is what we can also do, despite the fact that I agree that in these difficult times, it is yet to be seen, or it has yet to be seen, whether this is really the right background to negotiate a new social contract now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Hans. I will now ask just one second question to all three of you, because I've heard from Henrik that we have a lot of questions from the audience, and I would like to encourage the audience now to, if you have questions, please do write them down in the Q&A section of the chat, so that we can also bundle perhaps some questions. So my question to the three of you is a little bit based on the picture that, Mustafa, that you have drawn. I fully agree. The situation after COVID will look quite pessimistic, quite bad, quite bleak for most MENA countries, because a lot of the rent incomes that the countries have built on in the past might or will fall apart. However, don't you three also think that this very fact is quite bad for the economy, but perhaps in a way good for reforms? Because when MENA countries have not conducted reforms in the economic and the political sphere, this was due to the fact that they could afford it. The rent incomes that they had made them independent in a way from the support of citizens, from the legitimacy inside, and also from support from outside. Now they will be extremely dependent on citizens paying taxes. They will dependent on the support given by foreign donors, and will not this very fact weaken in a way the negotiating position of authoritarian governments, and thereby in a way increase the potential for a more inclusive social contract. And related to this, and you can choose which of these two aspects you want like to answer, isn't there now a chance for donors to really pay attention to giving its support in a way that they support not just one side, not just one party of the social contract, but always give it in such a way that they don't strengthen governments, but strengthen, at least in the same way, societies, the other party of the social contract. So who would like to start? Perhaps if we just proceed in the same order as before.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. Absolutely excellent questions and very good points that have been made. I will just make very quick two observations. One is that there is no doubt in my mind, as has been said by the various speakers, that the reforms that the pressures and the difficulties are going to be intense. There is no doubt for change to happen. There is no doubt about that. The question is whether this is going to give place to something new that is orderly. Because a social contract is essentially a way to order the social relationships and not to get into some chaotic relationships. So while I see the pressures for change, they have been building up for a long time and they continue to. And as I had said, whether it's the climate change, whether it is whatever you pick issue, and COVID-19 just is an additional one, what you are going to have is huge pressure change. The question is whether you know what to replace the previous social contract with. And the point I'm making is that we don't know. The international financial institutions and many think they know that they have a recipe. They know what is the social contract. And I bet to tell you that they don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Today, at the global level, we are questioning globalization. And at the same time, we are telling MENA region, open up to globalization. We are questioning technology and we are saying, get technology. We are questioning the financial sector development and we are telling them open to financial sector development. We're questioning a lot of things at the global level. We're questioning markets. We're questioning the capital system. We're questioning even democracy. And we're telling the people of the MENA region, just select a new social contract which we think is good for you. Who are you to know who is good for me? I don't know myself what is good for me. So I'm trying to figure out today what is the right social contract for me today. And I have a very difficult time to come up with something that is acceptable and reasonable. Societies have a very difficult time to come up. So there's no doubt about the pressures, but whether this is going to produce the outcomes that we think, or some of us think are the right ones, that's what I am questioning. We don't know.
Thank you very much.
And the political systems and it comes to political systems, and political systems are not well established to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very, very important point you make. Ayat, please.
Okay, you ask what is bad for the economy could be good for reforms. I would argue yes. I think if you want, and there I'm not disagreeing with Dr. Mustafa. I think that if you take the social contract as a whole and all of what comes into it to really strengthen state-citizen relationships, it is a big challenge. And I agree that there are many things in there that where the current construct and the reactions of the government may not move in the right direction. However, what I would say is that there are many other things where the path is clear, where a clarity on what can be done and engaging citizens on these options can get us these right reforms at this time. And now is the time, now is the opportunity. Let me give you a few examples. Water, and I keep coming back to water because it's really critical for the region. The Jordan Water Authority, the COVID-19 crisis has doubled its deficit. Is this not now the time to talk about water use efficiency, talk about cost recovery, talk about managing this resource better? It is. And I think managing that dialogue and managing the information around sharing, information around what citizens pay and what they get in return, that is an important reform. It has to happen. It has to happen now. Similarly, cities and their productivity in MENA are among the lowest. Cities do not provide the productivity dividends for its people in terms of jobs, etc. Is it not now the time to look at digital transformation around connectivity, around green transportation, around managing, especially as the job impetus and the types of jobs are changing around us as we speak? That's an opportunity for MENA, some of MENA cities to leapfrog and really transform into the cities of the future that they need. Similarly, on spatial inequalities, and again, I go back to Tunisia, Dr. Mustafa's country, the spatial inequalities have been huge. And that is part of the erosion of the trust of citizens with their. Can we not look at really how do we bring about connectivity and communicate with the citizens around that? Farmer support models have been going through a socialist era for the longest time, and now is really the time to transform that. These are fundamental pillars of how, again, the social contract as a whole, as you have defined it, comes together. We may not have the answer to tackle the umbrella, but we do certainly have the answers to tackle many of these pillars.
Thank you very much, Ayat. Hans, last not least.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I will focus on the second aspect of your question, whether this crisis and COVID-19 and the necessary recovery doesn't offer a chance for donors to support both sides on the continuum of the social contract. And I think, yes, it does. But I also think this is something that we have anyway done in the past already. We are talking more or less here about the rules of engagement and how we see ourselves and our roles and our influence on partner governments and partner societies. And what we have always done is that we work with governments and with state institutions, and at the same time, we also work with the civil societies, with NGOs, and with actors actually that can bring about change in these countries. And we always kind of try to bring them together to enable dialogue and debate, and through this also maybe contribute to a certain extent to certain aspects of a new social contract. Whether COVID-19 again here provides this this new chance that this deepens further, or that we become more inclusive also in the way how we work, will also depend heavily, I think, on the timing. Because obviously, if we have actors that do not have an interest in changing a particular social contract, one can also use this crisis now to say, you know, first of all, we have to focus on the survival of everyone, and we have to focus on a very, very quick recovery and stabilizing the anyway already bad situation. And you know, these aspects of inclusiveness and transformation of the economy and including kind of marginalized parts of the community and the long-term reforms, this is something that we have to postpone until, I don't know, 2021, 2022, and the next crisis coming. So I think also this question depends a lot on the answer, also on the timing actually, and whether the international community and the partners are willing and able to also focus during this crisis on long-term outcomes and reforms.
Thank you very much, Hans. Thank you very much, all three of you. I think it's time now to hand over to Henrik. Henrik, you have already prepared a strategy for selecting some of these very many questions that have arrived in the chat.
Yes, that is at least the plan. I will try to be as strategic as possible. So thank you for your questions, and thank you first of all to the panelists for your very interesting inputs. I believe it was not always very optimistic, but it was very honest, and I think it's much more useful to have an honest debate than an optimistic debate that doesn't fit the reality. So thank you very much for that. We have received so far 9 questions in the Q&A section, and the idea now is to give you the microphone, to give you the floor, so you can ask your questions to the respective panelists. I will collect 3 questions now, then we will give the floor to the panelists, and then we will go to the second round and so forth. For the first round, the questions will be around the issues of the role of the state, governance, anti-corruption, and so on. And the people I would like to ask their questions now are Salma Mashour, Sonja Nodara, and Fabio Coriolano. So the first one would be Salma Mashour. We will then unmute you so you can ask your question. If you don't want to ask a question in real voice, then I can also read them out, of course. But Salma has already agreed to ask her question in real voice. So please, Salma, introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Salma, and I also graduated from AUC, and my master's 1 semester was in the University of Tübingen, so some familiar universities. I have a question. I don't know who I'm directing the question to, whoever has an answer, I guess. My question is, do you think overinvestment in prestige projects and large public projects in the Middle East is detrimental to prospects of growth?
Thank you, Salma. So the question is about the role of the state as an investor, let's say, in the framework of what that means for the social contract. Thank you very much for that question. The second question would be from Sonja Noderer, who has a question about corruption. Sonja, would you like to ask a question in real voice, or should I read it out? Sonja, are you there? If she's not, Sonja, I'm going to read out your question. The question was, isn't corruption the key obstacle rather than conflicting visions? Elites clinging to the status quo not to lose their spoils in the game, like in Lebanon. And I guess many other countries would also fit into that list. So the question is around the issue of corruption. And the third question, before we give the word back to our panelists, comes from Fabio Coriolano. Fabio, can you hear us? And would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, my question...
and please present yourself, Fabio.
Yes, my name is Fabio Coriolano, sorry. I'm a PhD candidate at the Gdańsk University of Technology in Poland. And the subject of my study is the welfare state in the Islamic countries. Looking for an Islamic character of the welfare state, let's say. Related to the area of my study, when Professor Leuven mentioned the fact that the citizens in the MENA country are less and less trustful toward the government when they see how poorly they are managing the COVID crisis. It reminds me something that I read concerning the Turkey in the late 90s and the fact that emergencies like very terrible earthquakes faced where people that were damaged by this earthquake were not helped by the state, but by Islamic organization and charities. As we said, I think, I don't remember which panelist said that now there is a larger commitment of social communities. So my question is, in this situation, considering the fact that the state is ill managing the situation, you think there is room for major reliance on Islamic organization, first socially and then politically, as it happened in Turkey with AKP?
Yeah, thank you very much, Fabio. So I guess we have three questions that revolve roughly around the role of the state, about the state as an investor, about the state and its governance structures and anti-corruption mechanisms, and the future of the welfare state after the crisis. So I would give the floor back to all three of the panelists. Maybe Ayad, do you want to answer to one of those three questions, maybe, or to all three of them?
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much, Henrik, and thank you to our guests who are posing these very interesting questions. Let me tackle the first one and on large investments, because actually we've been thinking about that. It's a knee-jerk reaction of governments to come up with big, large investments in response to these crises. In fact, they've existed before the crisis, and you can debate in many of them whether there is really the economic returns, whether the placement of them or the timing was the right one. So I mean, again, without getting into the conversation around whether these investments, let's assume that these investments indeed prove feasibility, but is it the right time to do them at this time, given the limited fiscal space? If the answer is that it is, I think there are a number of things that need to happen for them to really bring dividends at this point. First and foremost is make sure that these investments are resilient. We are seeing many infrastructure investments in particular that have not taken into account climate scenarios, whether it is a dam that will not see water in 10 years or a transport project that is going to be heavily impacted by a shift in again, microclimatic conditions. So definitely make sure that these investments are resilient. The second thing is make sure that there are linkages. And here I want to, for example, give the example of Tangier Med in Morocco. That's been a big investment. It's a logistics port. It has provided a lot of dividends with backward linkages to urban upgrading investments and support to the city centers for productivity. You can create many more linkages which are critically needed at this point in time in terms of economic recovery. We need to make sure that there are public jobs, that the jobs created are also going to the small and medium enterprises, to the individual workers, intensive labor works, etc. So that is critical. Let me end by saying that doesn't mean that we don't need to continue to focus on improving the enabling environment for the private sector. These are not the solutions that are going to create the jobs for the many that are needed over the next 20 years, including those that have been lost to COVID this year. So in their agenda of private sector participation, which is critical and complicated, as we know in many of the countries, requires that that is maintained at the focus. So public projects cannot really substitute for really a need for a market that allows private sector to work efficiently and under clear market rules.
Thank you very much. So you basically answered the question of Salma. So maybe Mr. Früh of Hans, would you like to answer maybe to one of the two remaining questions?
Yes, I'm very happy to also to maybe refer to the corruption question there, and I totally agree that obviously corruption is one of the flaws and one of the really hindering aspects for growth and prosperity in the region. And I think when we discuss corruption against the background of social contracts, we have to also admit maybe a not so popular view, but I think there is some truth to it, that corruption is often part of the at least informal social contract within some of our societies. And I will illustrate this by something I heard from a mayor many years ago when I was a junior in a municipal development project. And he asked me a question, and he said, you know what is worse than a corrupt public inefficient administration? And the answer was inefficient public administration without corruption, because then you don't get anything done. And I think what we see in many societies is that corruption plays a role in public service delivery, and to ensure that some parts of society which do not have access on a official or through official channels to certain services, that corruption is a harmful yet existing backdoor, which is often used there. And I think especially now with the COVID response and with the recovery, we need to focus on transparency aspects. We need to focus on compliance in our projects, and I think also the partner countries need to put the debate, I think, on fighting corruption at the very center. This is everything but trivial. This is everything but simple, because the technical fix to corruption is often well known, but corruption in its very core is also often a political question, and hence also part, at least, of the social contract in the dark.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Mustafa, the question that has not been answered yet is the question on the future of the welfare state and the role of maybe religious actors in that field. So feel free to answer to that question, but also if you have anything to add to what has been said before by Ayat and Hans, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will start by saying that actually the three questions are all about corruption. The issue of prestige project is really an issue about corruption, actually, because you have somebody deciding about projects which are not good for the public interest, but they're good for the some private interest who is pushing for them. And the issue of organizations which are not government organizations replacing the government to do something, it's because of the corruption issue. So it's all about corruption, actually, the three questions. I would like to make 2 points about corruption. The first is that there is the efficiency side of corruption. the efficiency impact, which is one problem. I'll just say a word about it in a minute. But the other side of it, which is really the more corrosive, the more dangerous, is that it destroys the fabric of society, because it destroys trust in society. Corruption means that there is no trust. Everybody has to pay everybody. Everybody has to buy off somebody else. So there is no trustful relationship. So the social fabric is really destroyed. And that is the big cost of corruption. That is why corruption is, because it provides, people will feel cheated. People feel that the others are rich because they don't deserve it, because they are cheating us. And this destroys trust in society and the trust in relationships. So it's much more than the efficiency issue, the efficiency, of the economy. We know that there are many examples where corruption is good from the efficiency point of view, economic efficiency, as was said by Hans earlier. But we forget always about the other side of it, but the social capital issue that really destroys and is very costly. And that's the big obstacle, I think, that Sonia was talking about. Now, on the ways of dealing with corruption, I would like just to make one point here. Very often, strategies and policies to deal with corruption try to deal with the symptom rather than with the causes of the corruption. Corruption is a symptom of something else. Corruption is a symptom that something is really badly wrong about your system. It's about the political system, about the government system, about the rules and regulation, about the environment, about the way you are dealing with issues, resolving issues, and so on. And sometimes, anti-corruption policies and strategies tend to try to reach out to the effect of corruption at the transaction level. And if you don't go up and deal with the root causes, you are never going to be resolving the issue. So corruption, when it becomes a problem, becomes a very systematic problem, very systematic issue that has to be dealt, systematically. And we have to be very careful about the solutions, because solutions sometimes are worse than the disease itself, if you like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for putting all these things into perspective. I believe we still need to answer at some point the question on the future of the welfare state, but maybe we can do it in the next round, because for the next round, I have selected 3 questions that revolve around the issue of the social contract itself. We have received a number of questions that want to have a more precise idea of what it actually means. So the second round of questions would be for Rally Schechter, Anja Zorb, and Fritz Jung. First, I will give the floor to Rally Schechter, and then to the 2 others. But again, if you don't want to ask your question in person, then I can also just read them out loud. But Rally has already answered that he's willing to speak. So please, Rally, the floor is yours if you're already unmuted.
Yeah, thank you, Henrik. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Rally Schechter, Middle East Studies, Ben Gurion University in Israel. My question relates exactly to the nature of the social contract, because so far we've mostly been discussing a social contract as an agreement between the states and citizens. And my question is about social contract among society, or in other words, what kind of social change is required to allow a new social contract for the region, or in countries of the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rally. The next question I have is from Anja Zorb. Anja, can you hear me? And would you like to ask your question live, or should I read it out loud?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. My name is Anja Zorb. I'm currently a long-term lecturer at Birzeit University. I've graduated from University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. First of all, I want to thank you all for this webinar series and for the great discussion we were able to listen to today. So it's not so much a question I have, and let alone that it is really difficult to find a consensus on even the concept of social contract. But it's, yes, it's always a nice buzzword, let's say. But I rather doubt that the governments, specifically the government in Egypt currently has even the interest in doing something in this regard. Then my question is, do you see anywhere in any country of the MENA region currently efforts by government members to approach civil society actors only for discussion about possible policies for the future in establishing such as a social contract or building up issues or building up policies for a welfare state? I would have another question for the anti-corruption too, but I think this we need to leave for another time.
Who knows? I mean, we have 20 minutes. We have 20 minutes left. Thank you very much for your question. Very good question. The third question for this round would be from Fritz Jung. Fritz, can you hear me? Would you like to ask your question in person? Otherwise, I can read it out loud.
Yes, hello, Fritz Jung. I'm head of cooperation at the German Embassy in Tunis. So my question goes to Dr. Mustafa, who was talking about the situation in Tunisia. And yes, it's true. I mean, what you described, the very conflicting views on many fundamental issues and the difficulty coming from there to really see a consensus a school of thought for fundamental concepts. I really concur, or I can follow you in that thinking. But my question to you is then, so what is the especially long-term consequence of this lack and incapacity you described of consensus and compromise and social contract, if you want, in Tunisia, in your view? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fritz. So we have three questions. First one was about societal change that we need in order to, achieve a social contract. The second question was, are governments at all interested in having a new kind of social contract? And the third question, a bit more precisely, concerning Tunisia, what would be the consequences if we don't reach such consensus? And this is why I would like to start with Dr. Mustafa, since the last question was clearly directed to you. Maybe you can answer this question, and then I will give the floor to the two other panelists.
Fritz, that's a difficult one.
It's a challenge.
Challenge. Okay, let me start by saying a word about the because there was some comments about the nature. What is a social contract? I would like to say something. A social contract is not a set of reforms. Where there is this tendency to bunch up a set of reforms and say we need to do this, we need to do that, and then say this is a social contract. No, that's not. A set of reforms is not a social contract. But the social contract might lead to some reforms. So the social contract are the fundamental rules and norms and positions that a society agrees to, and that they're not questionable at every step of the road. So this, I give you two or three, that's the ones I talk about usually. And what is the role of private sector? Do we agree on what kind of role private sector should have in an economy, in a society? Should we agree on a broad role, a big role, wide role, or a small, restricted role or something? What kind of redistribution do we want to have in society? How much redistribution do we want to have? There should be some agreement on that. How do we do this redistribution? In the old social contract, we used to agree that we do this redistribution through subsidies to products. We do it through employment in the public sector. We do this and that. If we agree on redistribution, we should agree on what are the broad rules of that redistribution. How should we do it? Those are the broad things that the social contract is about. Should we agree that we should make freedoms and individual freedoms as a fundamental part of living together or of living together? So once we agree on that, then there are lots of reforms which follow. And then, so having said that, what are the long-term consequences if there is no social contract? Actually, for the last, okay, let's say 25 years, or we are not living in the old social contract. Actually, the old social contract collapsed somewhere in the 90s, by the end of the 80s, early 90s. So for the last 25, 30 years, MENA countries have not been living within a given well understood social contract, but like they did in the 70s and the 80s. So the consequences, the long-term consequences of not having a social contract, we know them. It means that we're going to muddle through. We are gonna lack a vision. We are gonna lack a vision and understanding in which society will work, minimize tensions, minimize conflicts, and try to have a vision towards which it's gonna work. And that vision will be much more effective and efficient if it were available. If it is not available, we're gonna muddle through. It's gonna be costly. We're gonna be successful sometimes. We're gonna be, falling on the side road for some time, and we're gonna live through that. And that's what's gonna happen.
Thank you very much. And thank you for clarifying also on the other issues. Maybe Ayat, if you would like to elaborate on the questions that have been asked.
Great. No, very good questions, really, Anja and Fritz. I mean, I just want to say, just picking up on this issue that the social contract, the old social contract is collapsing. I think the way, and it goes to what social change is happening in the societies as we speak. With social media, with access to information, with the digital technology, the transformation of societies from agriculture to industrial to service oriented. I think all these changes are eroding the old social contract. It is collapsing as we speak, and the problem is that there are no platforms for discussing and debating what this new redistribution of wealth and the rules of the game are. At the same time, I do think that there are impetuses, and I just use the example of Lebanon with the latest disaster that has hit Beirut. What we have been working on is a very, quick and massive effort of estimating the damages, the losses, but also looking at the recovery framework that really puts the people at the center. And it builds on the demands that people have been expressing already in the past around why the state has failed them. So I think building on these momentums is going to be critical, and making sure that it is organized in a framework that allows for people to see what the trade-offs are and what the path for a recovery or a reconstruction in particular, in this case, will look like is the only way to go. Now, we understand that there are a lot of underlying political, manifestations that make the trade-offs very difficult and a lot to play. But what I'm going to say is that the voices of the people in the street and what they care about, what they've expressed over the past year in Lebanon is really basic. They want services that are affordable. They want continuity. They are very worried about the environment for them and their children and the future of the country. So I would say that these are the impetuses for a dialogue and for some of these changes to happen, and we capitalize on them.
Thank you so much. Hans, maybe you could also elaborate on the question if from your point of view, governments are interested in working towards a new social contract.
I'm very happy to do this, but I would also start with responding to Reli's question and the aspects of vertical and horizontal aspects of a social contract. And I think it's a very important point that he mentioned here, that we are often in this debate, and also in the way how we facilitate the debate, are focusing on that relation between citizens and the state, and assuming that citizens are a kind of unified actor, while in especially the MENA region, with all its fragility and all the conflicts there, where in many countries, parts of society don't even agree that they want to live together, and where a lack of trust is so paramount, this horizontal aspect of the social contract and kind of the need also for dialogue and agreement between different groups of society is also something that I think we should not forget and that we should focus on, especially because I think it is key also for inclusiveness, and also in answering the question who is actually allowed or who should be allowed to actually participate in the negotiation of a new social contract, or in the definition of the relations amongst different actors in such a society. And I think a lot boils down here to the question of values, and again, also mutual expectations amongst different parts of the society. And do we see actually governments in the region expressing their will to renegotiate a new social contract? Well, I think what we do not see is a lot of public statements about it and a lot of public invitations from governments under the headline or under the umbrella of social contracts. But I think what we see is indeed the willingness, at least in some aspects of reforms, to engage with relevant stakeholders, and also a growing understanding maybe that reforms can only be pushed through if you have at least a minimum consensus and a minimum kind of a level of support by the public. And we have seen last year in Jordan, the government in Jordan, they presented the new prime minister back then. He presented his program in his agenda, and he indeed used the term new social contract for Jordan. And now we all know that this didn't quite take off, at least not to that degree that was expected at that point. But we also see that the term is echoed in the region, and that there is some momentum for this. But beyond this, I'm not aware of any other examples where that term has been coined by particular governments or used kind of in the internal debate.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much to the panelists. We have time for one more round of questions before we need to come to an end. It's always good if we all have the impression that time flies. That means that we have a very interesting debate. So I have 3 more questions that I would like to include into the debate. The first one would be Luna Abusuere. Luna, would you like to ask you had quite a number of comments and questions in the Q&A section. Would you like to ask your question, and please introduce yourself?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the very informative session. It's actually a commentary, it's not a question. And I don't want to take much of the time of everybody, but the issue is that we do really aim to move towards a more open political system, more competitive and inclusive economy. And we know that maybe we are dreaming much higher than our realities. I agree very much with what Dr. Mustafa Nabli have started the conversation with, or his intervention with, but I also would like to look at a more positive angle to what COVID-19 brought to the region. We do want to, of course, work towards developing a new paradigm, new social contract, look at the relationship between the state and society, knowing also the realities of the region, from corruption, from poor governance, from a stagnating economy, etc. Not to elaborate much on that, we realize that the COVID-19 brought so many economic and social impacts to the region, with increased poverty and reduced productivity, a negative impact on the service sector, etc. But it also brought some positive change. And this change should be developed and sustained. In my view, at the individual level, a higher sense of responsibility is developing, coupled with boldness in holding the state responsible for the protection of lives and the provision of functioning and responsive health system. individuals in the region have called for the state to intervene to protect their lives, basically, and to intervene and provide them with a responsive health system. We know that the region lacks time investments in the health infrastructure and education systems, and this has actually come so apparent to the surface in this crisis. On the other side, from the government side, the concerted efforts have been seen, or at least felt, to gain the trust and support of the people, with continuous improvement of crisis management performance from the beginning of the crisis back in February, March to now. There has been some slow progress in improving systems and tools in managing this crisis. And it's important for us, whether we are regional research institutes, development institutes, international partners, to work on building this political, if we call it political will or political commitment, to develop a national framework of resilience and to work on helping them improve their accountability and transparency.
Thank you, Luna.
So basically, there is hope, and I think we should build on the crisis and its what it brought to us at the individual level and at the government level. Thank you
very much, Luna. Thank you for giving a more optimistic tone to this debate. That's something we need these days. The next question would be from Mahinur El-Badrawi, who has a question about the role of the international financial institutions, I guess directed to Ayad. Mahinur, can you hear us, and would you like to ask your question, please, and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Henrik. My name is Mahinur El-Badrawi, and I work for the Center for Economic and Social Rights. It's a New York-based organization that works on envisioning a rights-based economy that works for the people and the planet. And my question was, in the obvious lack of democratic governance in the region, where there's no channel for a representative, participatory, and a democratic economic governance, do you think the IFIs and development institutes are ready to act on their obligation and for international cooperation that is sustainable and that generates inclusive, rights-based economic policy priorities that work for everyone? Can we see a social contract that goes in beyond the citizen and the state, that involves those important actors in a way that then doesn't lead us into odious debt and kind of unfavorable situations like what Salma explained before, like mega projects and stuff like that, where it's just a waste of resources and then cooperation ends into, or leads unfortunately in situations where there's more deprivation and inequality?
Thank you very much, Mahinur. Very good question. And the last, it's more a comment, and please be brief, is from Donya Jemail. Please be as brief as possible since we're running out of time, but the floor is yours anyway.
Yes, hello. Well, thank you very much. And warm greetings to Mustafa and Ayad, whom I had the privilege to work with when I was at the World Bank. So really, my feeling is that when you look at the MENA countries and you see, and this is a brutal reality of how resilient our societies are, just like in many other societies, but we are really able of taking a lot before we react in any way. So my question is, for Tunisia especially, we've been saying, oh, we've reached rock bottom. Every time we say now we've reached rock bottom, well, no, we're digging deeper. So seriously, what do you feel, or what your vision is about what will it take? What would be the last red line for our societies? I'm talking especially economically, because obviously socially, that's a whole other story, but economically, to what extent will everybody say, okay, we've had it? Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing this debate again to the more pessimistic side, say. But Ayad, maybe since I believe two questions were more or less directly directed towards you, maybe you can answer first and then the two others can reply.
Thank you, Henrik. Look, I think the question from Mahinur around sort of expanding the stakeholders involved in the discussion around this social contract is of course a critical one. It does go back to the definition of how we define the social contract and how it is built up. But at the same time, just to answer from the perspective of an IFI, it's extremely important to create channels and mechanisms for consultations, for continuous dialogue, and for really enabling the sharing of information and data and the feedback mechanisms that allow for the IFIs among themselves and with the beneficiaries in countries to really gauge where is the needed support, where is the support needed the most, and how is this felt and seen and expressed by different people in the society, in particular in MENA countries, because of these differences in views. I just want to touch on one point that I think came in the chat, and we didn't have a chance to discuss it, but this is the whole issue of decentralization and national versus local governments, also going really local in terms of getting some of these discussions going. I think that is a big entry point. It allows for really decoupling a lot of the complicated issues and looking, and there I think the dialogue can be potentially more clear in terms of input, output, and what the expectations of citizens are. Now, again, decentralization is a big word, and there are lots of political economy aspects to it, but just making sure that you have capacity and power and empowerment and information at the right level, I think is an important first step. Let me stop here. It's a big topic, but just to say thank you also to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and to the group for this excellent debate, if I don't get the chance again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ayat. And Ayat has another meeting very soon, so she will need to log off in a second. But thank you very much for taking time to participate in this debate. It was very, very interesting listening to you. The next one I would like to intervene is Mr. Hans Frühauf, and then we let the final words to Dr. Mustafa Nabli.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks also, Ayat, to you and Dr. Mustafa and Friedrich Ebert Foundation and the IE for having me here today and for the invitation. The question on the tipping point and how hard do we have to hit the floor in order to make reforms happen is, I think, a very crucial one, and one that is or has been in our minds also in the past. And if we look at a couple of prolonged conflicts in the region, we find a lot of literature that writes as or describes situations as never been as bad as today, and then we see another round of crisis and another kind of another situation that is even worse. And I think if we look at the societies and especially at the economic aspects here, I think I would maybe provide two possible aspects that we should look very closely to, and one is the debt level and hence the space for governments to act at all, and here particularly the pension schemes and the public employment in the public sector. If we look at I don't know, let's take the example of Palestine. The Palestinian Authority is employing over 60% of the employment in Palestine is through public services, and if if the state cannot provide this crucial source of income for the society anymore, then I think we would hit a new record low and potentially a new trigger for reforms, or at least a new trigger for public demand to renegotiate that social contract. I will also leave it here. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for organizing this, and thanks for this, for the many questions and the very interesting debate.
Yeah, thank you for your very important contributions. Mustafa, you have the honor to speak the final words of the debate.
I'll try to be very quick. Thanks again for everybody, for the speakers, the organizers, and the participants. I don't want to leave with a message of negative prospects and negativity. So let me say a little bit what I really think is important at this stage. My view is that I don't want to be pessimistic. I want to be realistic.
Right.
And when I say realistic means that it is very difficult to expect the post-COVID-19 to be an opportunity to build a big framework, which is a social contract, just like this, because of COVID-19. COVID-19 itself is nothing for the social contract. The social contract is the result of much, much more than that. And each country is going to have to find its way towards that. There are countries which have more open political system. Tunisia is one. And it has to find its way to get to a new social contract. And it has all of the ingredients to do it, but it has to fix its political system. Other countries have to do the different road, which is to go from autocratic to be more open. And the social contract has to deal with that. So every country has to deal with the issue of social contract in a different way. It's not the same problem everywhere. All countries are different. So by the end of the day, a social contract is a political issue. It's not a technical issue of a set of reforms, as I mentioned. It's a political issue. It's a political act for the stakeholders in a given society to learn how to live together and give and take and to get a compromise on a number of issues, on a number of ways of living together. And this political act, this political action, if you like, is going to play out differently in different countries. And it's not COVID-19 which is going to shape it. It's all other kinds of things that's going to. COVID-19, I mean, social contract in Libya is going to be completely different things from what's going to come out from Morocco or from Iraq, because it's going through a civil war, if you like, and it has to get out of it, and it has to get a social contract. An oil-rich country's social contract is going to look different from another one which is not oil-rich. So let's not generalize. So I would like to be realistic, not expect too much from the pandemic impact, and but this does not mean that there is no place for action. There is a place for action today on everything. And like Ayat was saying, on whether it's on digital, on whether it's climate change, on whether it's decentralization, there is place for action today. But let's not try to push everything into a social contract and think like, okay, we're going to have something big and we're going to solve problems, and then the world is going to be beautiful. The world maybe is going to be beautiful. It's going to take some time, but let's be realistic and let's move forward pragmatically. And I think we'll get some way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mustafa. Thank you to all three of you. Markus, I hand back to you for the final words.
Thank you very much, Henrik. Thank you very much for these last words, Dr. Mustafa. I think the discussion has shown that it is worthwhile, first of all, diagnosing developments in MENA countries through the social contract lens. It's an interesting concept to see what is going on. However, it's also clear that there is not just one social contract, but there's very many, as you, Dr. Mustafa, have said at the end. And you have also rightfully stressed that perhaps people even in some countries do not know what kind of social contract they really would like to have. I mean, single persons might know, but there's a lot of disagreement within countries. So there must, first of all, be some kind of dialogue to find a solution, to find something that is acceptable for at least a large majority of people. At the same time, and I think you also have stressed it, people outside the region should stay away from telling people in the region how their social contract should look like. I mean, they can facilitate negotiations in the region, but they should not say what kind of reforms they should do in order to achieve a new contract, neither us researchers nor the international organizations. And I fully also agree that COVID-19 does not automatically lead to a new social contract, and I share a lot of your pessimism. But I think what has also come clear during the debate, we should at least try to use the opportunity in a gentle and sensitive way to use every opportunity to facilitate discussions on the social contracts in the region. Okay, this from my side. I would like to thank now all three of you, Ayad Suleiman, Professor Dr. Mustafa Kamil Nabli, Hans Frühau, for taking your time, for giving excellent statements here on the debate. But I would also like to thank all of you out there at your computers for staying with us until this very moment. I just see there's still a lot of people, still 50 participants in the room, even though we have overdone quite a lot. And for asking very excellent questions. I think I benefited a lot from from also the questions that were coming from the auditorium. Last not least, I would like to thank Thomas Klaes at Janis Grimm at Friedrich Ebert Foundation and my colleague Mark Furness for organizing this series and events, and hope to see you soon again. And now I hand over to Henrik in Tunis for last words. Thank you, Henrik.
Very last words. Thank you, Mark. The very last words is another thank you to participants and the audience. And a reminder that next week, next Tuesday, we have the third event in the series of 4 events of this series under the title Protest Potentials in Post-COVID MENA, the third wave of the Arab Spring. Should be a very interesting debate, at least as interesting as this one. Thank you so much, and please join us next week for the next round. Thank you to all of you.